Hey everybody, welcome to another study in the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 14 today, which means we're getting close to the end of his gospel. Before we look at chapter 14, I just wanted to say a quick word about the conflict between the religious leaders and Jesus. You know, that's a pretty common theme in the Gospel of Mark. It begins early on, chapter 3, as a matter of fact. And it's going to reach its crescendo, its climax, in the Passion Week, which we're about to study. And it will lead to the death of Jesus Christ, that conflict. The Passion narrative, which includes the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. This is the central theme of the gospel message. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 4, Paul tells us that the death, burial, and the resurrection is in fact the gospel. And he says, it is of first importance. I mean, there's nothing that rivals it. And so no wonder that the early church put a premium on recording and writing the Passion Week of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And they wanted to put it together as a whole and circulate it among themselves because it is core, it's central to everything that it means to be a Christian. We can also tell the importance of the passion and the resurrection of Jesus by looking at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You see, they record the story and they give a lot of room in their Gospels for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I was looking at Mark and I realized that there are 661 verses in this Gospel. Did you know that 128 of those verses are dedicated to the Passion and resurrection story? 242 of those verses are dedicated to the last week of Jesus' life. It begins with a triumphal entry and, of course, ends with the resurrection. So you can see how important this is in the gospel story. Now, that leads us to chapter 14 and the first two verses. If you're there, let's read them together, and then we'll kind of make our way through several verses in this chapter. Now, the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. These two verses are the gateway. They're the introduction by Mark to us into the Passion Week of Jesus' life, the final week of his life. And again, that will include the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. He talks about the Passover. The Passover it is the Jewish festival commemorating the occasion when the angel of the Lord passed over the homes of the Hebrews on the night in which he killed all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. You need to know about that, and if you need more information, go to Exodus chapter 12, and you'll read the story there. It's important to understand not only the Old Testament, but also to understand what Jesus is doing the last week of his life. Now, since the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples was probably a Passover meal, and that would have been on Thursday evening, the incident we're about to read in the life of Jesus in Mark chapter 14 probably took place on Wednesday of Passion Week. Now remember, Mark sets it up by saying that the religious leaders had long been looking for a way to get rid of Jesus, and now that passion to get rid of Jesus is white hot. They make no bones about it. They want to kill him, and that's what they're going to do. But they were smart enough to know that they needed to exercise some caution, and one of the reasons was Passover. This pilgrim feast would bring great throngs of people to the holy city, Jerusalem, to celebrate Passover. I read where the normal population of Jerusalem during that time was about 25,000. During the festival feast or the pilgrim feast of Passover, the population would swell to over 50,000 people. So the chief priest and the teachers of the law, who, by the way, represented the two main bodies of men who made up the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish high court, well, these men realized that it would be too risky to move in on Jesus with such a huge and highly excitable crowd in Jerusalem for Passover. The possibility, Mark tells us, for a riot was too great. And you see, if there was a riot, then the Roman officials would be unhappy, and they would come looking for the Jewish religious leaders saying, "Can't you control your people?" It would not be a good thing for these religious leaders. So they were thinking the wiser thing to do is wait. Wait for Passover to end. Wait for the throngs of people to leave Jerusalem, and things will be quiet, and then we can make our move on Jesus. Now, you know that's not what happened, because it wasn't God's plan. Jesus is going to die during the Passover. Jesus will be resurrected. It's going to happen this week, not because the religious leaders wanted it to be that way. As a matter of fact, they probably didn't, but because God wanted it to be that way. And there's a lesson that I won't spend a lot of time with, but something you and I should think about, and that is we make plans, and we think we're wise, and we may think we have the resources and control to pull off our plans. But we need to remember that God's plans always supersede our plans. His will always be done. And we see it here in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, one of the reasons why the religious leaders maybe changed their thought and went ahead and arrested Jesus during this time was because one of Jesus' inner circle chose to be helpful to them in executing their plans to get rid of Jesus. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Let's read this beautiful story that happens in Mark chapter 14, beginning at verse 3. While he was in Bethany, talking about Jesus, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Now, I want to tell you, before we look at a few details of this story, that the placement, the chronological placement, where Mark has it is different from where John places it. Why? I can't tell you for sure. One thing that I think is that Mark is more interested in theological concepts, more so than being correct chronologically. And it seems to be the case in this instance. Now also, if you're familiar with Luke chapter 7, you might read Luke chapter 7, the story in verses 36 through 50, and you might say, "Hey, that's the same story that we just read in Mark chapter 14. I don't think so. In Mark chapter 14 and in John 12, you have one story, this story that we just read about this woman. It's a completely different story, a completely different event in Luke chapter 7. And I think if you read and look at the details, you'll see how different they really are and come to the same conclusion. Now, Mark tells us that this event takes place in the home of Simon the leper, and he lives in Bethany. That's an interesting way to describe somebody. Simon the leper. He was probably a leper who had been healed. And the retention of the name the leper by Mark may indicate that Jesus was the one who healed Simon of his leprosy. And that leads to the question, well, was this dinner an attempt by Simon to express his gratitude for what Jesus had done for him? It could be. Also, Mark does not specifically identify the woman who's anointing Jesus with this perfume, but John does. John tells us that it's Mary, who has a sister named Martha and a brother named Lazarus, and they live in Bethany. Mark talks about an alabaster jar. This was a container that the perfume was in, And we know that these containers, these alabaster jars, had a long neck. And when you were ready to pour the contents of what was in the container, you would break the neck of the jar and then proceed to pour. And that's what Mary did with her perfume on the head of Jesus. We're told that this perfume was made of nard, and nard was made from the root of a plant found chiefly in India, and it was very expensive. So you can visualize in your mind's eye Mary pouring this very expensive perfume on the head of Jesus. Now, when you look closely at verses 4 and 5, you notice that Mark doesn't specifically name who these folks are that are so upset, they're indignant at the waste of this costly perfume. But the Gospel of Matthew does. It says it's the disciples. And John is even more specific than that. He says it's Judas Iscariot. Judas was probably the most vigorous in his dissent. He was the most upset because he also served as the treasurer for the 12. And the chief concern of these people, the reason they're upset, has to do with money. We're told by Mark that the value of the perfume was more than 300 denarii. And to appreciate that, you need to understand that a denarius was 1 day's pay. So it's 300 days' pay, 300 days' wages that are being poured on the head of Jesus. So they talk about the poor. They say, look, we could have sold the perfume and we could have used the money, 300 days' wages. We could have used that money to help the poor, to take care of them. What a waste, they say. And one of the reasons they might have been thinking about the poor at this time was because it was a custom for the Jews during the Passover to give gifts to the poor on the evening of Passover. That might have been one of the reasons why it was really high on their radar during this time. You know what? When you think about it, the insensitivity of the disciples to totally miss what is going on in this act by Mary when she anoints Jesus is kind of amazing. But on the other hand, if you remember, all throughout the Gospel of Mark, we see these moments where the disciples just don't get it. They don't understand what is going on, whether it's Jesus teaching or an event like this, when somebody is doing something so wonderful for Jesus. Mark, as a matter of fact, uses the word to describe how upset they are that could easily be translated angry or violently displeased with what is going on. That's how they felt toward Mary about what they considered to be such a waste of pouring this perfume on Jesus. And what kind of makes this all the more surprising is these same disciples had often been guests in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and enjoyed their hospitality. But they just didn't get it. Now, if you look closely at verses 6 through 8, Jesus rushes to Mary's defense. He'll have none of this criticism of her. He commends her for what she does. This action, he views it as a beautiful expression of her love and devotion to him, and she should not be berated for what she has done. And he says, hey guys, in addition to all of this, do you understand I'm not going to be here very much longer? He knew that his death was impending. He was going to be crucified, and then he would be raised, and then he would ascend back to the Father. And so he says, the poor, you talk about the poor, you'll always have the poor with you. You can help them at any time. They'll always be here, but I won't. Now, it would be a misinterpretation of what Jesus is saying there to take it to mean, well, you don't have to care for the poor, or minimizing in any way the care of the poor. All you have to do is look at the teaching of Jesus, and you know that he loved the poor. He wanted to take care of the poor. He wanted his disciples to be generous and kind in giving to the poor. That's not what he's saying here. He's simply saying, you talk about the poor. You'll always have the poor here. You can always take care of the poor. But I will not always be with you. That's why what Mary is doing is so important. Now, another interesting thing that Mark tells us is that Jesus interprets Mary's actions, the anointing that she does, as a way of preparing his body for burial. Whether Mary understood that or not, we don't know. It could be that she was more perceptive, more sensitive than the disciples, and yes, she picked up that he's going to die soon. Maybe not. But Jesus says, and he interprets what she's doing as a way of preparing his body for burial. And in that statement, he is predicting his death, his passion, his death on the cross. If you look at verse 9, let's read verse 9 together again. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. This is an indirect way, if you think about it, of predicting his resurrection, because the preaching of the gospel presupposes the resurrection. And I love that idea. And I also love that he just simply says, hey guys, what you've witnessed, what you've criticized, what Mary has done will be remembered when the gospel is preached. And we're doing that right now, thousands of years later. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. All right, now let's move on to verses 10 and 11 as we close. It says, Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. These verses, 10 and 11, I think are connected to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14. And you have the story of Mary in between. You remember in verse 1, Mark tells us that the chief priests and teachers of the law were looking for a way, some sly way to arrest Jesus. In verse 11, it says of Judas, he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. You see how those go together. Judas is identified as one of the 12, which meant that he was within Jesus' inner circle. And you see what a valuable tool he would be to this religious leaders group. They would be able to know where Jesus was going to be, what his plans were, and they could figure out the best time with that information to make their move to take Jesus down. The most opportune time. Now, you and I wonder, what motivated Judas to betray Jesus? Lots of guesses, lots of speculation has been made concerning it. Was it jealousy? Was it greed? Was it disappointment with Jesus' mission? That's just a few things that have been conjectured. Who knows? We're not told. It's interesting to me, none of the disciples, none of the gospel writers venture to give a reason for why Judas chose to do what he did. We just don't know. We're moving in to the passion of Jesus, which will culminate in his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And so continue to join us as we finish this study in the Gospel of Mark.